Last time I was presenting to you a part of reproductive biology, which was the male reproductive system, the female reproductive system, and also the gametogenesis. The important terminology, just a review: the testis, which was the main principal sex organ of a male, the accessory ducts, the accessory glands, and the external genitalia. And I've compared between the male and the female reproductive systems on the same lines. I drew a parallel between the male and female in the same sequence: gonads, ducts, glands, and external genitalia. That was followed by gametogenesis, where we started with the spermatogonium, and on the other side we spoke about the oogonium. We used the language of primary spermatocyte, primary oocyte, then we said secondary spermatocytes, and on the other side we said the secondary oocyte and the polar body. And here the secondary spermatocytes becoming spermatids, and that was followed by spermiogenesis becoming sperms. And on the other side, the secondary oocyte after fertilization will become the ovum. Today, after reviewing the basic terminologies of male-female reproductive system and the gametogenesis, let's get into this particular cycle called the menstrual cycle. As we view the human physiology, we have too many cycles: the cardiac cycle, Cori cycle, ornithine cycle in the liver, sleep and wake cycles, and today we will learn this menstrual cycle. Before I continue with the stages of the menstrual cycle, let me answer which group of animals will have this unique cycle in the world of zoology. The primates. The primates, which includes the apes, human beings, etc., will have this unique cycle in the females, the female primates. Now, in the menstrual cycle, when does it start in a human female? When does it end? And what kind of terminology can you give to that? The commencement, the beginning of the menstrual cycle can be called as the menarche. This is at the time of puberty. The first menstrual cycle can be called as menarche. How long does it continue? Maybe around 50 years of age. And what do you call later? It's called menopause, after which there is no menstrual cycle. And now, after learning about the initial and the ending of the menstrual cycle in a female lifespan, termed as menarche and menopause, these cycles, the menstrual cycles, happen every 28, 29 days, all through the life in between that menarche and the menopause. Now, let us see how many stages are there in the menstrual cycle. I have listed here the 4 stages, the phases of the menstrual cycle. The very first one, the menstrual phase, proliferative phase, ovulatory phase, and the last one called the luteal phase. Let's understand what this menstrual phase indicates in a female. Menstrual phase is the initial phase. It will last around 3 to 5 days. During this phase, called the menstrual phase, the inner lining of the uterus, which we call it as endometrium. We call the inner lining of the uterus as endometrium, and this layer will be undergoing changes. What kind of changes are they? The inner lining of the uterus, called the endometrium, will be removed, will be cast off, and the capillaries, beneath that layer will be broken. So there will be certainly a menstrual discharge. Does a menstrual discharge contain any blood? Yes, definitely yes. This clearly indicates that the female is not pregnant. And when there is no menstrual discharge, it can also mean when there is no, I repeat myself, then there is no menstrual discharge. It could be a sign of pregnancy. And if there is a menstrual discharge, indication of not pregnant. What are the other reasons which we can attribute here, wherein we can say the female is not having the menstrual cycle or the menses? Maybe poor health, nutritional disorders could be some of the reasons for lack of menstruation. We were discussing about the menstrual phase, which takes about 3 to 5 days. Graphically, diagrammatically, when you look at this idea, 1, 2, 3, 4 and 5, 3 to 5 days. And you can see the endometrial lining of the uterus being a bit removed, eroded. So, I have not drawn a very thick endometrial lining. After the menstrual phase, the next one is the proliferative, multiplication, the growth. And this is certainly coordinated by the hormones, the gonadotropins, the follicle stimulating hormone and the luteinizing hormone. They do play a very important role, FSH and LH, products of the master gland from the anterior lobe of the pituitary. We generally call it as adenohypophysis. If you look at this representation, I have started my explanation from the follicle growth. You can see from year to year, it's like primordial, primary, secondary, tertiary and a fully grown mature follicle. See the time, the 13th, it's ready by 14 for the ovulatory phase. At the moment, we'll discuss about the ovulatory phase. Let's understand, throw light on this particular part, proliferative phase, proliferation, multiplication, increase in the number. Which hormone does this action? Follicle stimulating hormone. Follicle itself is indication of group of cells. So, a hormone which is encouraging, stimulating the making of the follicle is called the follicle stimulating hormone. This gonadotropin, the FSH, promotes this change. And as you know, the primordial follicle will have the primary oocyte. The primary follicle, the cell's number has increased, and again you have the primary oocyte there. And see here, this is the secondary follicle, and you must notice the presence of a cavity there, which we call it as antrum. See this antrum there. I have drawn a black color boundary here, indication of the fibrous stromal tissues from the stroma coming closer to the follicle, which I have discussed in the previous session with you. After the primary, this comes the secondary. Notice the increase in the number, formation of a outermost layer, the antrum, and as you continue, we enter into this stage called the tertiary follicle. And this tertiary follicle, the antrum size will increase, the theca will be much more better. We can call it as theca externa, theca interna, and theca interna is endocrine. And important changeover here will be the primary oocyte, which is diploid, has to become the secondary oocyte, which is haploid. This primary oocyte becoming the secondary oocyte is possible only because of the reduction division, and that is meiosis 1. So, it clearly means that the primary oocyte, which is diploid, has completed the meiosis 1 and has become the secondary oocyte. From 1 you get 1. And what about the other one? It's the polar body. So, one primary oocyte, which is a diploid structure after the meiosis 1, is giving rise to the secondary oocyte and a polar body. Both are haploid. And secondary oocyte and a polar body. The question is, what will be the fate of the polar body which is formed first? The polar body, which is smaller in size, containing about 23 chromosomes in that, most of the time it will degenerate. What about the secondary oocyte? It has to continue, the larger structure. So let's conclude. The primary oocyte after the meiosis 1 gives rise to secondary oocyte and a polar body. The secondary oocyte will remain, and secondary oocyte formation here is an indication that the sex hormones from the follicle cells is being released, like the theca interna releasing the estrogen. So something parallel, a secondary oocyte, estrogen secretion will be parallel. And understand, as you proceed, the estrogen levels, as the follicle is advancing from the tertiary to the ready for breakup to give away the secondary oocyte, the estrogen levels will be increasing. That's a very important sign. Increase in the estrogen level in the blood plasma certainly will bring the necessary changes. After throwing light upon this proliferative phase where the follicle is ready, what is happening in a human female blood, and who will get the signs of understanding the release of the LH, sensing. So we have seen the proliferative phase before, wherein the follicle has improved in its size, grown in size, and is ready for rupturing. But the noticeable point is, estrogen levels have already increased to a certain level, and now that is an indication to the brain, hypothalamus and this pituitary gland, where they have to get ready to release luteinizing hormone. Luteinizing hormone will reach its peak at this point. Very vital point. So if there is luteinizing hormone, then only there is possibility of this ovulatory phase. LH has a very deciding role in this particular ovulatory phase. Then the luteinizing hormone, what does it do? The luteinizing hormone will act on this follicle, the completely ready follicle. Look at the time, it's the day, that is 14th, exactly the mid-menstrual cycle. There is rupturing of the Graafian follicle. We call that fully grown follicle like that. The Graafian follicle, when it is rupturing, now two things happen. One, the release of the secondary oocyte. Remember, they are surrounded by zona pellucida with some cells around called corona radiata. I have drawn it here. The center is the secondary oocyte with a black color circle here, which is the zona pellucida, and this one is the corona radiata. You can see that group of cells being released away. This is nothing but ovulation. So that means LH has done or promoted the ovulation. Once this entire set is discarded, whatever is remaining here, we call it as the corpus luteum. The corpus luteum is nothing but the remaining follicle cells, of course within the ovary, and they start producing the sex hormone progesterone. Progesterone, which is a steroidal hormone, acts on the inner lining of the uterus and brings several changes, preparing a female uterus for pregnancy. Now there are two options here. Does this corpus luteum continue or the corpus luteum degenerate? The corpus luteum continues to release the progesterone for 3 to 4 months if the female is pregnant. Otherwise, the corpus luteum there begins to degenerate and ultimately becomes a tissue like this, a scar, a remnant, a degenerated body. That is called corpus albicans. That means if you start, they are counting from the 14, 15, 16 like that. Here, by the time you reach this 28, 29, the entire corpus luteum is transformed into the corpus albicans. And if this happens, again, immediately the menstrual phase will start. That means the entire endometrium, you can see this line which I have drawn up like this. It is because of the progesterone, the wall of this uterus, the endometrium has enormously grown, especially see this marked growth of the inner wall because of the progesterone. And once the corpus luteum becomes the corpus albicans, this entire thing will start disintegrating, removed, and you can see the beginning of the menstrual cycle. That means this one begins to get disintegrated, removed, and that is what you see at the beginning of the menstrual phase. The entire cycle will restart. So let's emphasize on two important points. Whenever the LH is released, the mature follicle will break and there is release of the secondary oocyte, which is called ovulation, that is collected by the fimbriae and enters into the fallopian tube, and the tissue which remains here, the group of follicle cells, you can call it as corpus luteum. Corpus luteum releases progesterone, preparing the uterine wall for implantation, pregnancy. That's why I have shown this thick structure, indication of endometrium. In the absence of the pregnancy, the corpus luteum is transformed into corpus albicans and the entire process will restart. Now let's see how hormonal fluctuations happen during the course of the menstrual cycle. I have drawn like ups and downs concerning the menstrual cycle, something a coordinated event in a female body. Let's take into account the very first one like this. See, the follicle stimulating hormone. See, follicle stimulating hormone and the LH together will be responsible for the total event to commence. And see this, the FSH is going up, going up, going up. And keep looking at the days also, as you at the bottom of this line, FSH is going up like this. It has to. And even the LH, especially LH, because there is no ambiguity about LH. Clear, very clear. This is LH. The next segment of learning is the fertilization. Now, when we say fertilization for eutherian mammals, the terrestrial organisms, the human beings, it has to be the internal fertilization. Let's see how the sperm starts its journey to reach the ampulo-isthmic junction in a female body. The testis contains the seminiferous tubules, and after spermatogenesis and spermiation, the sperm can follow this journey, the rete testis, vasa efferentia, epididymis, and then the ejaculatory duct, the urethra, and because of insemination, the sperms will be discharged into the vagina. And I have not written here the glands. We know that the prostate gland, seminal vesicles, the bulbourethral glands, their secretion also can be added up here. The semen is introduced into the vagina during the insemination. The sperms continue the journey from the vagina, uterus and the isthmus and ultimately reach this point which is called the ampulo-isthmic junction. What is inevitable is that the ampulo-isthmic junction will be the site of fertilization. Let's get into the next topic, which is fertilization. I have given here the journey of sperms starting from the testis. Testis contains seminiferous tubules, and from seminiferous tubules I have taken the sequence. Seminiferous tubules, the rete testis, vasa efferentia, epididymis, vas deferens, the ejaculatory duct, the urethra, and the semen, because of the insemination, is discharged during the coitus into the female reproductive tract. The semen containing sperms and other secretions of the male reproductive system will start its journey from the vagina into the uterus and then into the isthmus, and here is the ampulo-isthmic junction, which is the site of fertilization. What is essential is, by the time the sperms reach that ampulo-isthmic junction, the secondary oocyte should also reach the ampulo-isthmic junction and then there is fertilization. So, the chances of fertilization are very bright only when the secondary oocyte and the sperms reach that 𝗵𝗿𝗺 junction almost at the same time. And look at the thing here, ovary after ovulation is releasing the secondary oocyte. So, ovulation means the release of secondary oocyte, and that is collected by the fimbriae of the fallopian tube, and it passes through the infundibulum, the ampulla. The wall of the fallopian tube, made up of the smooth muscles, facilitate that process, and that is internally lined by the columnar ciliated cells, which enable the secondary oocyte and other group of cells to move. And of course, here and there you see some nourishment giving cells called the PEG cells. I have drawn here a secondary oocyte which is ready for fertilization at the 𝗵𝗿𝗺 junction. The important parts of this would be, this is the secondary oocyte and the polar body, the first polar body which is formed. I have not drawn it here, and this is the secondary oocyte, and here is the zona pellucida. It is a layer which is around the secondary oocyte, which is called the zona pellucida. And as you see, a group of cells which are encircling the secondary oocyte after the zona will be called the corona radiata. They are nothing but originally the granulosa cells before the follicle cells, but they are specially bounding around or present around the secondary oocyte. Now, the sperm, which is having the acrosome, the head, the neck, the middle piece and the tail, arrives. Which sperm will arrive? Is it 22 plus X or 22 plus Y? The chances are 50-50. But male decides the gender. The sperm, as it is approaching this cluster of cells, corona radiata and the zona pellucida with the central secondary oocyte, it will have some changes here. The tip called the acrosome will break up. When the acrosome here is breaking up, there will be discharge of different types of enzymes, and they induce changes. One of them will be, there is an enzyme which is called hyaluronidase. This enzyme specifically acts here, the junctions between the cells. And when the hyaluronidase, let me write the spelling, hyaluronidase acts on this cell junction, which is composed of hyaluronic acid, definitely there will be a rupture, a break, and that facilitates, see here, I am removing this, and cell is slightly separated, here no disturbance, and this is, the sperm makes its way. This is just one of the examples of the changes which can happen when the sperm is penetrating. And definitely it is only one sperm. It is called monospermy. Polyspermic condition is prevented by several mechanisms. At the moment, I am talking the monospermy, and the sperm has released the enzyme and it is beginning to penetrate this and will cross the zona pellucida, and this entire male gamete with 23 chromosomes will be ultimately entering into the cell. This will initiate the meiosis II, the completion of the meiosis II, and this will be transformed into the ovum and releasing of the second polar body. We have seen the entry of the sperm, and then when the sperm is making its way into the cytoplasm of the secondary oocyte, initiating the meiosis II, after which there is ovum and the second polar body. I have drawn here for you the entry of the sperm, which is already done in the it is penetrating into the cytoplasm, and this is the second polar body which I have drawn. And please do not forget that zona pellucida, the glycoproteinaceous layer, will remain during the embryonic development, early stages of embryonic development, it will remain until implantation. A very important point. It will remain until implantation, the zona pellucida, and implantation will occur in the uterus plate. The sperm has already made its way into the cytoplasm of secondary oocyte, and this will initiate the meiosis II to happen, and the secondary oocyte is changed, transformed into the ovum and releasing of the second polar body. In this diagram drawn here, the sperm is already in the cytoplasm, and see here male pronucleus containing 23 chromosomes, and this one the female pronucleus of the ovum, which I called it as ooted or the female gamete, and this nucleus called the female pronucleus will have 23 chromosomes, and female is always with one X chromosome, the ovum is always with one X chromosome, and remaining 22 will be half this set of autosomes. The male pronucleus in the cytoplasm here will proceed towards the female pronucleus, and once the fusion called amphimixis happens, that results in the synkaryon. The synkaryon is a nucleus containing 46 chromosomes, and they can be 44 plus XX or the 44 plus XY. And now you can declare this ovum, the egg, ooted, the female gamete, as a fertilized egg or a zygote, and that is still covered by the zona pellucida, please. Zona pellucida, the glycoproteinaceous layer, will be present until there is a process called implantation within the wall of uterus. Let us see what is the next generation's gender and who decides that. I was already informing you that human male decides the sex, the gender of next generation, the progeny's gender, by the heterogametic male, because he produces two types of sperms, one is X, other is Y. If the sperm with 22 plus X is fertilizing the ovum with 22 plus X, ovum is always 22 plus X, the result is 44 plus XX, and that will be a female gender. So, sex is decided at the time of fertilization. The moment there is fertilization done, the gender is determined. The second possibility, 22 plus Y, 22 plus X, the sperm is with Y chromosome, the ovum is with X chromosome, and together 44 plus XY, and now Y and X, you can see XY, the next generation is a male. What is the probability of the next generation being male or a female? Every time the chance is 50-50. Let me take one example. Suppose in a family of about 4 kids, what is the chance of the fifth to be either a male or a female? It's always 50-50. The probability of female is 50, the probability of male is 50. The reason is quite clear. It all depends upon which sperm fertilizes the ovum. And let me remind you, the site of fertilization is always ampelo-isthmic junction, and the chances of fertilization will be bright only when both these gametes reach the ampelo-isthmic junction more or less at the same time. As we have determined the gender of the next generation, and the emphasis should be on one fact, the simultaneously the gametes reaching the ampelo-isthmic junction. What will be the next step ahead? The next step ahead will be the development of zygote, which we call it as embryonic development. The zygote, which is a diploid structure, result of fertilization, will commence the mitotic divisions, which we call it as cleavage. So, zygote will begin cleavages, and after embryonic development, implantation, the stages like gastrulation, etc. Ultimately, after gestation period, the next generation is born through a process called parturition. Dear students, it becomes necessary to get some valuable hints when we read several topics. Last time we were talking about the reproductive biology and the male reproductive system. So, let us take one hint about the male reproductive system. I have written 1, 2, 3, 4 and 5 there. Here what I find is 1 stands for the testis, one testis, TES, TIS, and here 2 to 3 centimeters in width and 4 to 5 centimeters in length. So, whenever you want to recall the dimensions of testis, this is one of the good hints. 1 standing for one testis and 2 to 3 centimeters in width and 4 to 5 centimeters in length. And what about temperature? How to remember how much it is less than the body temperature? At the end of this number, there is 5. You divide it by 2, you get 2.5. So, you have divided by 2, 5 divided by 2, you get 2.5. That means this is the temperature 2 to 2.5 degrees centigrade lesser than the body temperature. So, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and the last number 5 divided by 2, you get 2.5. So, between 2 to 2.5 degrees centigrade, it is lesser, the scrotal temperature is lesser by 2 to 2.5 compared to the abdominal temperature. After taking the hint concerning the male reproductive system, let us start the journey of life commencing from zygote. All animals, right from the poriferates to the chordates, the mammals, we see the life unfolding from the unicellular diploid stage termed as zygote. As the complexity is very high in mammals and they have reached the pinnacle of evolution, their complexity, their functional ability will be of high order. So, let us start the journey of life. I have written here the zygote. Already zygote is there in the ampulo-isthmic junction and it may be male or a female. Of course, both will have 46 chromosomes. I have not removed this layer, the glycoproteinaceous layer called the zona pellucida. It is still intact and it begins the cleavage. So, cleavage is a mitotic cell division and we get 2 cell stage and then again the 4 cell stage, and as the mitosis continues, 4 will become 8 and that will become 16. You can see 2 becoming 4, 4 becoming 8, 8 becoming 16. This 8 to 16 cell stage, the multicellular embryo there, a tiny structure, can be called as morula. As it moves from the fallopian tube, ampulo-isthmic junction, the isthmus, and slowly into the uterus, it is transformed into blastocyst. The blastocyst is again still covered by the zona pellucida, and you can see the cells have been divided into 2 varieties. There is a kind of differentiation. The outer layer of cells called as trophoblast, and you can see the inner layer of cells, large group of cells forming the inner cell mass. Now, the blastocyst which has entered, it is into the uterus, it is in the uterus now, the blastocyst, and having this zona pellucida with trophoblast cells and the inner cell mass. So, it is ready now. The blastocyst is structurally ready to penetrate into the wall of endometrium. But is endometrium ready to accept this structure? Endometrium is certainly ready to accept the blastocyst into its layers. How is this possible? Because I was telling you, in the course of the menstrual cycle, if the female is pregnant, the zygote is formed and the next generation is going to develop, the corpus luteum continue to persist, releasing progesterone. The progesterone continues its action on the inner lining of the uterus, that is the endometrial layer, and that is highly developed. The thickening will be more, vascularization is more, the cellularity will increase. There are a lot of structural changes in the endometrium. So, when the progesterone is vitally influencing the endometrium and endometrial wall undergoing too many changes, certainly the blastocyst can pass through the endometrium, settle in the endometrium, and that is what is called the implantation. And once the implantation is done, the development will continue, the gestation period continues, but for implantation, what should happen? The zona, I have written here, the zona pellucida should go and interact with the endometrial lining. And we know that the endometrial lining is the perimetrium. I am just reminding the words of the uterus. This is the perimetrium, please, and this one is the muscle layer, that is called the myometrium, and the innermost one, which is, I am putting it more like a different, well grown structure, very thickening, thick structure, the endometrium, and it will have this, highly folded endometrial villi like that, very well developed. This is endometrium. A very concise presentation here. This zona should touch the endometrial lining. So, let us see what happens here. As it touches, I am bringing down the size, endometrium in contact with the zona pellucida, and this is the inner blastocyst with the trophoblast cells and the inner cell mass. This layer will be certainly removed during the course of implantation. Now, who is coming in contact with whom? The trophoblast cells, which are the outer cells, these are the outer cells, coming in contact with the endometrium, and it penetrates in and settles here. The outer trophoblast and the inner cell mass, this is what is termed as implantation. So, a review of the point: zygote, 2 cell, 4, then 8, then 16, 8 to 16, the morula, as it moves into the uterus, changes into the blastocyst, the morula changes into the blastocyst, blastocyst with zona pellucida, trophoblast cells and the central inner cell mass, and finally the endometrium is accepting the blastocyst, and this is nothing but the implantation, during which the blastocyst is embedded into the wall of the uterus, the endometrium, and the credit goes to the progesterone, which creates this magnanimous, wonderful structure called the endometrium. Dear students, after studying the menstrual cycle, fertilization and the process of implantation, let us discuss some of the questions and how do we quickly get to the answer, the right answer. I have written here a question about which day in normal menstrual cycle does rapid secretion of LH, normally called LH surge, occurs. LH surge, the term, can be used with a sudden rise in LH. Remember, there is a sudden rise in LH in the hormonal, the graphical representation of that hormones. There is a sudden rise in LH. Estrogen level is increasing. There is a sudden rise in LH on the nearing to the 14th day, and that is must for formation of corpus luteum and the ovulation. In this question, the question is asking us to which day will be LH surge. It has to be 14th day. Why not the others? Just imagine, on the 11th day if there is sudden rise in LH, it is not possible to have ovulation at that time, because mid-menstrual was the planning, the correct cycle, of the body wherein there is ovulation. 20th is too late because by that time the corpus luteum has been formed and there is release of progesterone. That is not possible. 5th day, the menstruation is still going on. So, this is too early, this is too late, and this one is nearing, but exactly it is not the mid menstrual cycle day. So, the answer is 14th day. Let us look into another question. In a human female, blastocyst, you all know that blastocyst is a stage where there is implantation in the wall of the uterus. Here the 4 options, one of them is gets implanted in uterus 3 days after ovulation. 3 days after ovulation, that is 14, 15, 16, maximum the 17. It has to reach the ampullo-isthmic junction and simultaneously the male gametes need to reach the junction, and the time lag is not correct there. And see here, gets nutrition from myometrium. Myometrium is a middle layer of the uterus, peri, myo and endo. Myo is a muscle layer, a smooth muscle layer, and that is not concerned with nourishment. So, the first 2 options are incorrect. Gets implanted by the trophoblast cells. Naturally, the blastocyst gets implanted. So, let me write the letter S here, gets implanted because of the trophoblast cells. The blastocyst is covered by the zona pellucida, that is touching the endometrium, and that is lost, and the trophoblast cells come in contact with the endometrium, and there is innervation, penetration into the wall. So, the blastocyst gets implanted because of the trophoblast cells, and let me remind you, there is no zona pellucida, it will be lost, and this is the right answer because the trophoblast cells touch the endometrium and that allows implantation in the wall of endometrium. Let us see the 4th option also. Forms placenta even before implantation. See, there is a chronological order for some biological events. How can there will be placenta formation even before implantation, which is totally incorrect. So, the answer is gets implanted. The blastocyst in a human female, blastocyst gets implanted by the trophoblast cells. The next question, menstrual flow occurs due to lack of. There are 4 different hormones given here. Let us see the first one, vasopressin. The vasopressin, the vasoconstrictor, vasopressin means that, and that is also called ADH, the antidiuretic hormone. The antidiuretic hormone is concerned with the reabsorption of water and sodium in the kidney. Second one, progesterone. This is what is the one released from the corpus luteum after its formation during at the time of ovulation. So, luteum and ovulation is almost a simultaneous event. So, progesterone, lack of progesterone means, as you know, 14, 15, 20, as you reach 28, in the absence of pregnancy, the corpus luteum becomes corpus albicans. When the luteum is becoming albicans, it certainly suggests there is no progesterone, and the absence of decrease or absence will lead to menstruation. So, that will be the right answer, called progesterone. Then what about 3rd and 4th? Follicle stimulating hormone is required, does play a role and is required in the early stages, maybe around after the 3 to 5 days of menstruation. From about 5, you can see the role of FSH, the follicle stimulating hormone, the gonadotropin, FSH. It starts promoting the making of the follicles from the primary, secondary, tertiary, and oxytocin is the one which is acting on the smooth muscle at the time of delivery, that parturition. So, it has nothing to do with the menstrual flow. So, this is eliminated, this and this easily, and finally, this is the one whose drop reduction will cause the menstrual flow? So, the answer is menstrual flow occurs due to lack of progesterone. Look at this question. Part of fallopian tube closest to ovary. So, we know that the fallopian tube will have the fimbriae, they are the margins here which I have drawn here, the margins of the fallopian tube, and that is followed by the fallopian tube. This one is the infundibulum and this is the ampulla and this is the isthmus. I repeat, infundibulum, the ampulla and the isthmus here, which is continuing into this uterus, and there is a cervix and there is a vagina. This I have not drawn. So, ampulla is here in the center. Isthmus is the lower one. Isthmus is here closer to the uterus. Infundibulum is this one which is the closest to the ovary. Cervix is very far away from the ovary. So, the answer will be part of fallopian tube closest to ovary will be the infundibulum. Let me remind you, infundibulum, which is a particular region of the fallopian tube, upon this side also, this term infundibulum is also used in the pituitary gland. When we study that pituitary gland, the stalk of the pituitary gland is called the infundibulum. So, let us see a sequence based question. Arrange the following in a sequence: corpus luteum, tertiary follicle, 𝗟𝗫 and corpus albicans. So, when we go through the events during the menstrual cycle in a female, we see menstruation first, the menstrual phase, then there is a proliferative phase. During the proliferative phase, the primary, secondary and tertiary. So, tertiary follicle comes, and that is followed by the release of estrogen. Tertiary follicle, the cells, the theca interna cells, the endocrine cells discharge the estrogen, and because of which there is LH surge, a sudden rise in the corpus luteum is called the LH surge, enormous amount of release. Okay, there is estrogen, then LH surge. Then once there is LH surge, the corpus luteum acts on the Graafian follicle, and that leads to the ovulation and corpus luteum. After luteum releases progesterone, and in the absence of pregnancy, the luteum is converted into the albicans. So, I have given you an overview of menstrual cycle. Keeping that in view, we can arrange the sequence. Look at this. First is there should be a tertiary follicle, then estrogen release and LH surge, rupture of the Graafian follicle, ovulation and corpus luteum. So, this is the next one. In the absence of pregnancy, the luteum which releases progesterone will be converted into the corpus albicans, and as we have seen in the previous question, where the lack of progesterone can lead to menstruation, and next menstrual cycle will start. So, it is B, the tertiary follicle, then the C, the LH surge, then followed by that is corpus luteum formation, and ultimately it is the D, which is the corpus albicans. So, the answer is B, C, A and D. So, arrange the following in a sequence. So, B, the tertiary follicle, C, the LH surge, A, the corpus luteum, and ultimately the D, that is corpus albicans. This is one of the sequential questions. Before we conclude this particular area in the reproductive biology, and we have unfolded the embryonic development too today, the sequence based questions, especially the menstrual cycle, is one of the sequence based questions, just like the spermatogenesis and the parts of the female reproductive system, the infundibulum, the ampulla and isthmus. Such questions need to be focused, sequence questions. Match the following. What is possible in a menstrual cycle? Match the following. It is like giving you on the left and the right, list 1 and list 2, the menstrual phase. They can give you the erosion of removal of endometrium on the other side, proliferative, formation of the follicles, the ovulatory phase, corpus luteum, ovulation, and the last one, the luteal phase, where they can talk about the release of progesterone. This is possible as match the following type. Do focus on the events, the exact day during ovulation, and the hormone ups and downs, the graphical representation of the hormones. And that brings to the end of this particular area called the menstrual cycle, fertilization and implantation.